Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn.
And I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And this is a special bonus episode where we're going to talk about male sexual functioning. And it's partially a response to our previous episode, episode 23 from 6 weeks ago, when we had a panel discussion entitled Masculinity, Male Sexuality, and Judaism, Navigating Love, Lust, and Intimacy. And Talli, a number of listeners raised questions based on that episode.
Yes, Scott. The feedback we got was that it was a really interesting podcast, but we took on a lot talking about male sexuality. And a lot of the questions that we received allowed us to understand that there were so many different aspects about male sexuality that has inspired us to go further and develop this course that we've been talking about. Many of the questions that we received had to do specifically with male sexual functioning, what to do about issues such as erectile dysfunction, premature ejaculation, or delayed ejaculation. And I thought that maybe we could just focus today on those issues in a very brief way. Obviously, in the future, when we do have the course ready, we will be speaking about this and other aspects of male sexuality, the more broader aspects, including the ideas of masculinity and anxiety and pressure to perform. All of these ideas will be delved into at a deeper and more fleshed out level in the actual course.
Like all of our episodes, Talli, it's important to emphasize these are the beginnings of conversations, not a comprehensive treatment of any given subject. There's so much to speak about regarding any of the topics we talk about, and masculinity and male sexuality is certainly no exception. Before we get there, let me first mention that we're grateful and excited that this is actually the second anniversary of the beginning of the Intimate Judaism podcast. We released our first episode on July 24th, 2018. And Talli, just for fun, I decided to look up today to see our stats from that very first day. And drum roll, please. We had 7 listens on our first day.
Wow.
Which increased to a whopping 9 listens on day number 2.
There were 2 that was you and I and probably my husband, your wife. So that would have been 4.
So 3 other people. We're very grateful to them. I will say that 2 days later, on July 26th, we suddenly had over 100. And thank God since then, we've really been growing to the point that we now have thousands of listeners. And we thank all of you for making this podcast a real success. That leads me to a big announcement, which is that after lots of talk, we're finally starting our Patreon page. Patreon is an opportunity for people who've benefited from Intimate Judaism to support the work that Talli and I do with a small monthly payment. In exchange, you'll get bonus material, episodes, merch, and more. If you enjoy Intimate Judaism, you should definitely check out our Patreon page and consider becoming a patron of Intimate Judaism. The link is in the description of the podcast, as well as in the show notes. We thank you in advance, and we hope you enjoy the bonus material that is there. Please subscribe to Intimate Judaism, share this podcast, and visit our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikvah list, and much more. Send us your questions and comments to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Make sure to visit jewishcoffeehouse.com, as well as Talli's website, tallirosenbaum.com. So Talli, let me open up by mentioning a letter that we got from somebody. He talked about our previous panel discussion. One of the panelists said erections can be involuntary. Is that correct?
Yes.
The problem with this is that Chazal very clearly wrote, Ein kishui ela lidat, which means erections are always voluntary. There's no erection that's not voluntary. This is more than a theoretical concept. There are other times that the Gemara will say something which is not necessarily according to modern science. The problem here is that this actually has halachic ramifications. Admittedly, the halachic ramifications are in some level far-fetched. We're talking about if somebody forces a man to have sex with somebody else, but at least in principle, this does have halachic ramifications. And the letter writer wanted to know how I would explain this particular idea. So I thought that would be a good opening to our discussion about male sexual functioning. First, let me mention the context briefly. The idea appears in Yevamot Daf Nun Gimel Amud Bet, page 53b. There's a discussion, we don't have to get into the details, of a man having sex unwillingly or involuntarily. The Gemara tries to figure out what that means. And let me read the relevant line right now. Ones dematnitin hechidami. When the Mishnah mentions a case of a man having sex unwillingly or involuntarily, What does that mean? What's the case? Ilema kishansuho ovdei kochavim uba'aleha. If you say that non-Jews forced him to have sex the way it sounds, and he had sex with somebody, v'ha'amar Rava, but didn't Rava say, ein ones le'erva, there can be no forcing a man to have sex. The concept doesn't apply to a man. Lefi she'ein kishui ela lidat. There is no involuntary erection. Accordingly, since having intercourse assumes an erection in many contexts, that's a different discussion. If a man has an erection, it can't be said that this was involuntary. The Gemara is saying erections are voluntary, and the idea that this man had his erection involuntarily doesn't make any sense according to the Gemara. How do we deal with this? The Rishonim actually deal with this specifically, and the answer to our question, as I see it, comes down to the way we define this phrase, ein kishui ela lidat. Lidat doesn't necessarily mean voluntarily, it means knowingly, and this is exactly the point that is the machloket, the argument between various Rishonim. So, for example, the Ramban understands this line as I've been translating it. A person who has an erection did so willingly, and therefore he can't be forced to have it otherwise. There's no such thing. But Tosfot, on the spot, say very, very differently. They understand lidat not as willingly, but as knowingly, meaning a person can have an erection unwillingly. But even though it might be unwillingly, because it's done knowingly, the person is aware that he's doing it, he has to theoretically give up his life should he be forced to do this. So if a person forces a man to have sex with another woman, even though he's not having his erection willingly, because it's being done knowingly, or perhaps even more accurately, knowingly and actively, therefore he's required by law to give up his life, even though it's not something which he technically wants to do. Let me explain what Tosfot mean by this. There are 3 transgressions in Jewish law for which a person is required to give up his life rather than violate them, namely murder, idolatry, and sexual impropriety. That means if a person puts a gun to somebody's head and says, go kill so-and-so or I'll kill you, a person has to die rather than transgress and kill that other person. There are, however, situations where this does not apply even in these 3 transgressions. When a person is completely passive, what is called karka olam, they are effectively just a piece of ground. They're not doing anything. They are an object that somebody else is using. Then that object, that person, is not required to give up his life. This is how it's explained how Esther, according to Chazal, went into Achashverosh and had intercourse with him, even though, again, according to Chazal, she was married to Mordechai. It said she's karka olam. As a completely passive partner, she didn't do anything technically, and therefore it was not under the category of yehareg vel yavor, something for which a person has to give up his or her life. Tosfot say in this case, if a man is forced to have intercourse with a woman that he's not allowed to have intercourse, and it's better that he give up his life for it, it's a case of yehareg vel yavor. And I should mention that Tosfot say we're not talking about a case where someone has a gun to his head technically, but instead he's literally physically pushing him together with that woman. Nonetheless, if the person didn't have an erection, in principle, Tosfot say, he's not doing anything. However, if he does have an erection, that means that he's no longer purely passive. It's not that it's voluntary, but it is knowingly. He knows what's happening, and accordingly, he has consciousness of it in a sense that makes him no longer a pure object, someone who's being acted upon. He's actually doing something even though it isn't voluntary. That's how Tosfot explained ein kishui ela lidat. Not that the person necessarily has control over it, but that should he have an erection, it's not something which is completely passive. So at least in terms of the scientific issue, Tosfot are quite in line with what modern physiology would say. There is such a thing as an erection that is involuntary. Tosfot just says the Jewish law doesn't really care. When it comes to forcing a man to have sex, he still can't do that and must give himself up should he be, in their very vivid example, forced to have sex with a woman with whom it's forbidden to have sex as one of the arayot by being physically pushed together, and he knows that he's going to get an erection. If the only way he can get out of it is by being killed, that's what he has to do, even though it's not technically a voluntary erection. I'll make one more point before I pass it over to you, Talli, which is that some people will ask, how could the Gemara not know that when men sleep, they very often get an erection? That's clearly involuntary. And how could the Gemara not know that? That's not modern medicine. And the answer is the Gemara knew it very well. The very next line of that Gemara in Yevamot says that explicitly. We're not talking about a person who's asleep. We're talking about when a person's awake. The Gemara was fully aware that when men are asleep, they get erections, and that is indeed involuntary. No matter which Rishon you hold by, the Gemara is quite clear that that's not what we're talking about. So that is an approach to this problem to answer the question of our correspondent.
Okay, that's really interesting. Can I just ask?
Please.
I understand the difference between willingly and unwillingly, and that it's clear that you can have an unwilling erection. Mm-hmm. But when you say knowingly, what would unknowingly look like?
That's a very interesting question. I would think that an unknowing erection probably means that the guy is asleep. Tosfot even talk about that. Tosfot say that should a person have an unknowing erection, or, for example, if he already had an erection before being forced to have sex with somebody, in a case like that, then in that situation, he does not have to give himself up because he's not doing anything then either. The problem, I guess, according to Tosfot, it seems, is to get an erection after being forced to do it. That's the non-passive part. If the person has an unknowing erection, whatever that really means, or if he already had the erection, he again is considered passive and doesn't have to give himself up.
I mean, without looking at the context, because it makes sense that it's in Yevamot in a way, because men have an obligation to continue the seed of their deceased brother. And it also is interesting because when you think about the whole prohibition against spilling seed, that's also was kind of a Yibum background.
It's in that context in Breshit, correct.
But it kind of makes sense what you're saying in terms of when a man has an erection, whether he intended or had intentional thoughts to have the erection or not, there's an awareness. There's an awareness of the erection, which might be another way of saying also that there may be an awareness of arousal, and that arousal does not necessarily indicate desire, does not necessarily indicate intention. And this is an important fact.
And that's exactly what Tosfot are saying. Even if he doesn't have a desire to be aroused,
right.
Sometimes it happens anyway. It's not a willing practice, unlike the Ramban who says that it is.
Right. So when you explain it according to the Tosfot, it actually works very well with what physiologically can happen, which is an unwanted erection, but an erection that nonetheless is experienced as such with the sensations of arousal, or
exactly.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's desired arousal, or that it's wanted, or that it
or voluntary,
or even pleasurable. It might be objectively pleasurable, but it's not actually experientially pleasurable. And modern science has also looked at women's arousal and lubrication as being kind of a reflexive process, which may actually be completely unrelated to the desire to enter into the experience, which is important because it means that for men and for women, there can be relations that take place or intercourse that takes place involuntarily, whether it's a coercion or a rape, while reflexive arousal responses take place. And that does not indicate the reflexive arousal responses in themselves does not necessarily indicate consent or desire or agreement.
That's a very important point.
Yeah, so it's really an important way to explain the statement that there's no erection without feeling something. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's no erection unless you caused it. That really wasn't the intention, or that's at least not how you're explaining it.
Yes, that's how I understand Tosfot, right. Okay, it sounds like Tosfot is very much in line with what you're saying then.
Yeah, so I think that that's actually a very good segue into understanding a little bit more about how sexual functioning works, because I think that many people really want to understand what is behind physiological functioning, how does it work? And in fact, what we know today is that it's complicated. There are a cascade of factors that need to occur in order for a function to occur. This is true for men and this is true for women, but I'm going to focus just on men. Basically, it's important to understand that the autonomic nervous system, the part of our nervous system which is not something that we can control completely, like breathing or digestion, is what modulates sexual functioning. So what generally can happen is that there can be some sort of stimulus, and that stimulus will cause the body on some reflexive level to understand that there is a process of arousal taking place, and therefore there needs to be all sorts of neurotransmitters and chemicals that allow for changes in the body and specifically in the genitals. And those changes are that the blood needs to flow in, and the tissue of the penis, which is largely made up of spongy tissue, will kind of expand and allow for the blood flow to come in. So that's on a very reductionist, technical level of what happens. Obviously, though, in a sexual setting, there's going to be many other factors at play. What we know about malfunction is that it's not just about blood flow. And if it were just about blood flow, then anybody who has a problem with erectile functioning would be able to take a pill such as Viagra or Levitra, which actually directly works on that blood flow to the penis, and it would work. And what we know is that for many men, it doesn't work, particularly when the context has more to do with performance anxiety. So when we look at male sexual function, we're looking at the physiological factors because the genitals are organs, and like all organs in the body, they will be affected by the aging process and smoking and illness and all the other things that affect our blood vessels and our muscles and our nerves, etc. So there's certainly going to be physiological factors, but there'll also be other factors. Those factors can have to do with stress, anxiety, depression, beliefs, interpersonal relationships, if there's a history of sexual abuse, or if there is post-traumatic stress. So there are many factors that go into male sexual functioning.
As a Chatan teacher, I want to ask you about performance anxiety. As we discussed in our previous episodes, the last one as well as the one about that Netflix series Unorthodox, men are often understood by society and many Chatan teachers to be ready to go without any explanation, without any education. They are told, you'll go in and you'll just know what to do somehow and figure it out. And similarly, the Kala, the bride, is told in certain communities, don't worry, the guy will figure it out. You just have to do what he says to do or whatever, some sort of assumption like that. Obviously, that can't really be true for many people. They don't necessarily know automatically what to do, which I'm sure leads to performance anxiety. Am I right?
Absolutely. And this goes back to the kind of phallocentric way that we look at sex. And so there is a way of an overfocus on the act of intercourse, and focusing on the act of intercourse means focusing on performance, both for the man and for the woman.
We see that in the Ketuvah, one of the 3 obligations a husband has by Torah law to his wife, apart from food and clothing, is sexual intercourse. And because of that, that also puts the onus on the man. I mean, as far as it goes to say it's the man's responsibility to his wife, that's all well and good. That's wonderful. It also means, however, that a man in his own mind would think, I have to perform this. This is something which I have to know how to do, and he may not be aware of how to do that.
Right. And I think that the pressure on men to perform is something that is universal. It is not only a problem that exists in our culture, but it also exists in Western society where men are expected to have a lot of conquests or act in accordance to what they might see in pornography, which is often really very much about erections and going for a longer amount of time, being able to function, and it's very intercourse based. And one way to be able to reduce performance anxiety would be to reframe sex not as a specific act, but as an energy that is going to now be legitimately expressed between a couple in a bond of intimacy and commitment and passion, and that it will include many things. It will include looking at each other, it will include touching each other, holding each other, creating pleasurable activities together, and one of those things will be intercourse. But when we make intercourse the thing, then that places a great deal of performance pressure.
So you're saying that by broadening the definition of what sex is in the minds of the couple, we're enabling them to have less of an emphasis on performance of a specific act and broaden it to include all sorts of things that they both know how to do already, such as hugging and kissing and simply being together.
Right. And for couples who have been shomer neged, which means that they haven't touched at all before the wedding or have touched very minimally, if any, they will need time to get used to what that feels like. Going back to the idea of sexual functioning, typically men's experience with themselves, as we've spoken about, if they have any experience with themselves, and likely they will have had some, it will sort of be clouded in some feelings of guilt and shame. And even though they're now allowed to feel aroused because they are with their wives and it is expected, it's gone from something that's been kind of shameful and I really shouldn't think that way, I really shouldn't do what I'm doing, to, oh, now I get to do this with my wife. That transition, it's difficult and it can take a long time to integrate into your sense of self that I am now a fully sexual person. In our podcast Zoom that we did on this topic, we had Dr. Hananel Ross, who spoke about his dissertation, saying that men don't find this particularly difficult, this transition. My experience in the clinic has been a little bit different, that the experience is a difficult one, but obviously these are men who have come to the clinic. So I think we need to also acknowledge that.
As a Chatan teacher, my main interaction with my students is before they get married, but it's certainly something which I make them aware of, to understand that this might be accompanied by guilt. And I try to dissuade them and I try to tell them there need not be guilt, but obviously someone's words doesn't necessarily inherently change a psychological process, but it's important that they be aware that this guilt is natural and to try and overcome it, I think.
Do you find that these young men who are preparing for marriage, do they express to you any sort of anxiety about performing, quote unquote? I put quotation marks around the word performing.
I've actually taught a lot of Chatanim, so my experiences are varied. It's rare, but it has happened. It's more common, frankly, after they're already married. Meaning, while we're studying together, it's unlikely that they're going to express such anxiety, although they certainly can and have. More likely, the week after the wedding, I get a call saying that they now have performance anxiety, which they had not anticipated.
Right. And that could be from a number of reasons, including the initial sexual experiences not quite going as they had thought it would go. But also, I think that it's reflective of our societal expectation of men. Of course you're going to be fine. Of course you're going to know what to do. Of course you're not going to have any issues or problems, because they don't even bring it up for the most part to their Chatan teacher, whereas Kala teachers will hear a lot of, what if it hurts and what if I can't and what if, there's a lot more what ifs there, because that sexual debut, desire and arousal and readiness does not seem to be as taken for granted.
I'm not a sex therapist. I'm not a couples therapist. So my reaction is obviously not based on any particular type of education I got in those areas. But it seems to me whenever I receive those phone calls, the most important message I can give them, which I try to give them, is that they should not feel that they're the only one, that this is the only time this ever happened to anybody, and there's therefore some sort of problem either in their sexual functioning or in their marriage. I tell them that, trust me, many, many people before you have called up with the same problem. And part of the issue is that they have to relax and not worry about it, because that itself feeds the problem. Whatever performance anxiety they had is then doubled by the fact that they think that they're unusual and that this shouldn't be happening to them and they don't think it's common. That just makes the anxiety that much stronger.
And also, like, a lot of young couples want to know, we're not consummating our marriage, whose quote unquote fault is it? When in fact, there really is a lot of interplay. In other words, what we also know from studies is that there's an interdependence of sexual functioning between partners. So any kind of issue with one partner is certain to affect the other. So for example, if one partner has premature ejaculation and the woman is not quite ready, that can create a situation where she's not sufficiently aroused and she's experiencing something painful or that she's just not ready for. These are all things to consider.
And premature ejaculation also has the added problem of people being worried about it from a religious halachic level. They say a person's not allowed to spill seed, and therefore if this happens in the context of foreplay, they feel guilty about that as well. It's important for me as a Chatan teacher to preempt this and tell them in the process of studying together that even if They don't want to accept what we said in some earlier episodes, that having non-vaginal intercourse is allowed in certain situations. People can listen to those episodes for more detail. Even if a person does not want to hold by that, a person wants to only have, or a couple only wants to have vaginal intercourse, they still have to realize that premature ejaculation is a human reaction to foreplay. It will sometimes or may sometimes happen, and that certainly is not a source for guilt. And I mentioned certain very well-known Haredi rabbis who've said that explicitly in writings, that a person should not feel guilty about this and should not start clapping his al-chet, clapping his chest and saying, I have something else to atone for on Yom Kippur. That's just part of giving pleasure to each other. And sometimes even if a person isn't going to try to have non-vaginal ejaculation, it can happen and a person shouldn't feel guilt about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of a little bit maybe going off the point, but it really is important to stress again that for both men and for women, this tremendous fear of extravaginal ejaculation is something that can cause a great deal of distress and anxiety and even trauma. So I think it really is time to look at how couples end up feeling so much pain from focusing all of their efforts in trying to begin an intimate life together on, where the semen ends up. There are women who come out traumatized from it and men who come out traumatized from it. We're seeing this all the time now. Now, as people are talking more about it, I'm sure it's been like that for a long time.
Getting back to the whole question of performance anxiety and reality that people have a problem having sex, Talli, what would be reasons that people would have problems with sexual performance?
Okay, that's a very complex question. I mean, it's really trying to explain the whole core of sexual functioning and dysfunctioning. But as I mentioned before, there are many, many factors that go into healthy sexuality and healthy sexual function. And we talked a little bit about some of the physiological factors that can affect functioning, such as issues with blood flow or nerves or muscles or those sorts of issues. And then, of course, there's psychological factors and relational factors. And we talked about psychological factors as having to do with anxiety or depression or stress or past trauma or beliefs. There are, of course, by the way, social factors, the expectation to perform, masculine beliefs about how men are expected and should be able to have an erection anytime they want. And also the ideas of sex being based on performance rather than pleasure. So when we can talk about sex in terms of an experience where two people get together and connect with each other and deepen their feelings towards each other and experience pleasure together, rather than talk about having an erection, which is long enough, strong enough, orgasms, those are all important parts of it. But if we can get away from looking at those as the indicators of sexual success or satisfaction, that already reduces some of the performance anxiety. In a big way, it's important to understand that the way sexual function works is kind of a balance of mechanisms, which are what we call the excitatory mechanisms and also the inhibitory mechanisms. This is true for a lot of functions in our body. If you look at the way our nervous system works, what I'm going to do is compare it to a car, because a car has an accelerator and a car has brakes. And even when you're driving, you're not going to just put your foot on the accelerator and go. You have to have brakes in order to drive safely. So when we look at sexual functioning, we want to appreciate that the accelerator would refer to the excitatory factors. So for example, what is exciting would be whatever visual stimuli or being in the mood or having relational interaction, which is positive, being in the right place at the right time, and all of those factors kind of being in place. Whereas inhibitory factors will be issues such as, is this the right time? Is this the right person? It's kind of like your thinking brain. It's your frontal lobe, which is saying, wait a second, we don't just do whatever we want. I have to make sure that this is okay. I have to get consent from my partner. We have to use birth control. So it's going to come in and regulate the arousal so that the arousal doesn't cause you to act in ways which are out of your control. part of the inhibitory mechanisms might actually go overboard. In other words, having obsessional thoughts or worries. Am I going to get an erection? Am I going to be able to ejaculate? What if I ejaculate too soon? What if my wife isn't enjoying herself? What if the baby wakes up in the middle? All of these thoughts can kind of be put on the side of the brakes. They can actually be inhibitory. And when the inhibition comes in, then you could actually lose the erection if we're talking about erectile functioning. But these inhibitory thoughts can also affect ejaculation. It can delay ejaculation. And anxieties can also trigger early ejaculation.
Just as we conclude now, if a man is having performance anxiety or problems in his sexual functioning, I assume you would say he should go see a sex therapist. Is there any other advice you would give him just al regel achad as we're concluding right now?
There's a lot to consider when a man has a sexual functioning issue. Depending on his age, and even if he's young, it is important to rule out, the same way it is with women, possible biological factors. If a man is middle-aged and he's overweight and maybe he's a smoker, suddenly not having the kind of erectile function that he used to could even indicate some sort of cardiovascular issue. So we don't want to ignore the possibility that there is something more systemic happening in his body. He's not eating healthy, he's not exercising, but we can't necessarily isolate that from other factors, such as he may also be depressed. There might also be things going on in the marriage. So sex therapy, for the most part, would be part of an overall approach to regaining sexual health. And whether or not that sex therapy or therapy should be individual or should be couples, I think would be something that needs to be decided based on the history of what's going on. Sometimes I would see a man alone if the issue really has a lot to do with their own anxiety, and sometimes there's, on a broader level, other anxious thinking patterns. So somebody might have OCD and be anxious about many things in their lives, and their sexual function is just one of those things, and that's distressful enough to bring them to therapy. And or there may be a whole relational dynamic going on that should be explored as well, where the partner may be adding to the anxiety, and being able to see in what ways the partner is adding to the anxiety is important as well. I do want to say that this is a very, very broad topic, and there's a lot to say about it. There's a lot to say about it in terms of education around sexuality. There's a lot to say about it in terms of education around body image for men, masculinity, treatment of sexual dysfunction. What are the available treatments, not just talk therapy, but also the medications or other sorts of treatments that are out there. And I think that to go into it on a deeper level would require a couple of hours, which is why we're hoping to do this course.
Yes. But right now, we're sort of on summer break, but we will be back with more episodes of this podcast in September, Bezrat Hashem. In the meantime, we thank you all for listening, and we thank you all for sharing this podcast. Please remember, again, to go to our Patreon page. Once more, the link is in the show notes and the description below. Write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Visit jewishcoffeehouse.com and tallirosenbaum.com. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye.